During this game development project, there has been multiple times in which I've been tempted to adding features that don't necessarily fit. They look cool, they sound cool, but for the purpose of the game, they don't fit. And I noticed that the balance there has been about making it realistic or making it make sense for the game, even if it doesn't look as cool. Because as many other developers have said, being realistic is not fun for the most part. So to give you a little bit more context, what I've been through was the dilemma of adding a stop after you land on a jump, or do not stop at all, which would make the game feel better, but it wouldn't look as cool. It would give less weight to the jump. And I wanted to do that not exactly because I'm making a realistic game, but because for the context that I was building, the character is pretty realistic for the most part. So stopping after falling would make sense, but it would hinder what I'm trying to attain while building the game. So the first dichotomy that I found was the one between realism and control, in terms of how much control you have over the character when you're playing. Because for instance, in a falling animation, when you land, it makes sense that you need time for recovery. That's so realistic that it even happens with people that jump all the time, for instance, basketball players. So it would make sense to add something like that for the game, because it makes sense. Even though in this case, it didn't really make sense for the game itself, because the game I'm making is heavily reliant on you being able to control your character to make quick decisions. So for my case, what I noticed is that not being able to move right after you land makes the game feel less responsive, which makes it feel bad to play, because if you jump all the time, you're gonna land all the time, and you're gonna be having these stop moments all the time. It's gonna hurt the flow of the game. It's really interesting though how realism has been something that has been discussed a lot, and when you ask some players what they like about certain games, they say, oh, that's realistic, how things interact inside the game. But in fact, if you look at it, many players do not complain about the lack of realism. If they ever do, they complain about the lack of believability. And this is something that I've been thinking ever since I started game design, even back when I was not developing a commercial release, a commercial game. I'm a firm believer that even implying realism hurts your ability to properly design the game, because you're going to be putting yourself into constraints that are really going to mess you up because you're trying to build something realistic, when in reality you should actually be worrying about believability. So if something is believable, if the mechanic is believable, if it makes sense in the context of the game that you're making and the world that you're building, then you don't really need realism in the sense of making something make sense in our universe, because it needs to make sense within the game. So the real take here is that as long as a mechanic, as a feature is believable within the world of the game, players will accept it. Now, of course, if you're building a game that relies on realism, such as a simulator, such as an FPS, which usually takes realism more seriously, or a racing game, depending on how realistic you want it to look, then realism becomes more important. And when it comes to realism, there are some games that we can compare. So for instance, we can get Control, which is a quite realistic game when it comes to graphics and when it comes to physics, but not really a realistic movement because the character can fly and there are telekinesis, but that works because everything makes sense in the context of the game. That wouldn't work in a Modern Warfare game, right? Or we can also talk about Celeste, which is a game about climbing mountains that allows you to double jump, and for the most part you're going to be solving puzzles, platforming puzzles, great puzzles. But again, nothing realistic about that, and nobody complains because it makes sense for the game that they're building. While there are some other games like Jump King, I think was the name of the game, that thrives on making you angry because you committed to a jump that for the most part didn't work, and then you fall through the level, and it works because that's the scope of the project. That's the main idea that they're going for when they made the game. Again, that's not realistic, but it plays into the control versus realism part that I was talking about. But when you know that you're developing a game and you see that you can do whatever you want, it's quite challenging to actually filter yourself and choose only what makes sense for the project, and makes it more cohesive in general. The interesting part is that once you have the power to make things realistic, you kind of think of whether or not that would be a good idea, that would make the game cooler. And then you start understanding why developers, more experienced developers, made games the way they did. That's all to preserve the feel of the game, the flow of the game. So one very important thing, which made me realize that probably one of the most important design choices that I made, was to actually have a North Star that I can follow and make it easier for me to make decisions without feeling that maybe either I would be missing out on a feature or I'd be putting something on the game that harms its main goal. So for example, if you're building a game that relies on precision when jumping, for instance, you can't lock the player mid-air without allowing him to course correct and go back if he needs to, if he thinks that he messed up the jump, because that will just feel frustrating. Unless that's the scope of the game and that's what you're after, as there has many games that have done that. If you're building something yourself, I would be curious, do you prioritize realism or responsiveness? See you on the next video.